Welcome back. The country's economy is in recession, ratings are under threat, and millions are without jobs. On Wednesday, recently appointed Finance Minister Tito Mboweni will have the task of delivering his medium-term budget speech. But with SAA, Eskom and Transet crumbling, is there much confidence left in state-owned enterprises? Will Mboweni be considering their privatization? Rating agencies have said that SOEs need to be reformed. The country's current debt burden sits at 246 billion rand. What is the way forward for the country's SOEs, and what can we expect on Wednesday? Well, joining me now to unpack this is Professor of Political Economy Patrick Bond, the Free Market Foundation's Leon Lowe, and Pan-African Capital Holdings' Iraj Abedian. Thank you so much for coming through. Before we take this discussion any further, let's start by pulling up what the Finance Minister has said thus far on issues to do with the economy. I mean, there's a lot that he's been saying, largely through Twitter, but look at this tweet. It says, "Dear God, open the eyes and ears of our leaders. Let them do 4 things," right? The state must own 40% of mining companies, start a state bank, implement appropriate land use planning, and create a sovereign wealth fund. What is so difficult? That is radical economic transformation. That is Tito Mboweni on Twitter some time ago. So let's take it back to studio then. Let's start. Let me start with you and ask you, what are your expectations? I mean, you heard his tone in as far as radical economic transformation is concerned, and from that alone, you can expect that state must own 40% of mining companies, a state-owned bank. He's thinking more state-owned state ownership than less.
Well, Tito Mboweni is a very interesting guy, and he tweets like Donald Trump. He just, off the cuff, shoot from the hip. I wouldn't trust any of those things to come into the budget speech. I think he'll do more or less the opposite. He'll be under pressure from the ratings agencies, and none of the radical economic transformation will be on the table. He even endorsed the BRICS Bank lending for nuclear energy in 2015 to Bloomberg, when he was appointed a director there, and then he flipped on that. I mean, we've got a very erratic finance minister. What I do think he'll do is play basically by market rules, and unfortunately those are going to be a continuation of status quo. Some of the highest interest rates in the world, exchange control liberalization, squeezing poor people, and I think those are where we're going to see the pressure building up before the election next year, and he'll be a very unpopular finance minister very quickly.
Wow. Leon Lowe, let me ask you then, should he continue to play by the market rules as Professor Bond suggests?
Well, let's first understand he's taken over at a time when South Africa is becoming less and less and less of a market. We have been slipping on all the indices that measure doing business, the Freedom of the World Index, Economic Freedom Index, Competitiveness Index. So South Africa has gone from about the 40th freest economy in the world to now the 110th. In other words, we went from the top 30% to the bottom 30%. And so he inherits a country that is headed completely in the wrong direction, and all countries that go down these indices all get worse. So if, for example, Patrick mentioned exchange control as if he likes it, which is really peculiar, because no sophisticated, advanced, high-growth country has it anymore. It's a real old apartheid dinosaur introduced to protect the apartheid regime. The modern version of it was invented by Hitler. And this government sits, and he sits, with all of these old apartheid dinosaurs that he's inherited: South African Airways, Eskom, railways, exchange control. If he wants to be radical, if he wants radical economic transformation, he would abolish the lot.
So we'll come back, and I can see that you're starting a fire already, and I could see Patrick Bond shaking his head as you were talking. But let me bring in Iraj Abedian. The time at which the finance minister comes in, I mean, in recent years we've had such a revolving door at National Treasury, and I was thinking a bit earlier on that for the last 4 years, the medium-term budget policy statement has been delivered by a different finance minister. How much space does he have? I mean, there were commitments that were made by Malusi Gigaba in February. Remember that?
Absolutely.
Regarding how to reform state-owned enterprises. What do you expect from Tito Mboweni this time around? How much room does he have
I think
to pursue reform?
Technically, he's got zero degrees of freedom. Growth is going the wrong way. Gigaba projected 1.2%. Now the Reserve Bank has brought it to 0.7%.
Well under 1%.
Well above, below 1%. But the problem is not this debate around what we do we privatize, do we nationalize, is such a really artificial, irrelevant debate, both of them. The reality is that we must get our policies right, our energy policy, not Eskom. The focus should not be on Eskom, it should be on energy policy. What is sustainable, environmentally compatible, globally competitive, and clean energy that will give us comparative advantage going forward, not next year, but for the next 20, 30 years. With aviation, what's the right policy in the 21st century? It may have been something 100 years ago. If we go back, we cannot turn the clock back. In terms of logistics, what are the boundaries and what are the potentials for investment to take this economy forward, given the resource base that we have? We are a mining-rich company. We've got a country. We have a vast country. We need to get logistics right. We can't have these trucks on the road. So this debate should really not focus on SOEs. They are broken. They're misplaced. They've also been looted. We know that.
Right. So we'll take the debate a bit further. Despite you saying that we should not even be having this debate, we should be looking at systems rather than entities. But before we do that, let's have a look at the financials, what the numbers tell us in terms of the performance or lack thereof of state-owned enterprises. Look at that. That has to do with losses that have been incurred by state-owned enterprises, and it tracks right all the way down to, look at SAA. Look at that figure there, well into the red. That includes the SABC, South African Post Office, Eskom, Rand Water. There you have it.
Yeah.
And then, are they generating much revenue? If we can then call that up and see how that stands in terms of the SOEs and the revenue that they do generate. So those are the figures. 177 is that billions? I think it is, on the part of Eskom.
That's right.
So now we have the picture. Let's get into the debate then. Patrick Bond, let me ask you then. We've heard government flirting with the idea of private equity, not calling it privatization. At some point, they were talking about selling off the share that government has in Telkom. It seems that has fallen off now, and no one is talking about that anymore. Should the state go all the way and basically say, if last year we gave SAA 10 billion rand to prevent it from defaulting on its debts, surely we can't keep doing this?
Well, yes, that's a very good case because the subsidies mainly go to people like me, middle class with white skin, the main customers who take most of the subsidies in flying. That's a very good one to debate one by one. But, SAA did have a private partner about 20 years ago, Swiss Air, and then they went bankrupt and had to fold. Telkom had a private partner, some Texans and Malaysians, about 22 years ago, and that was a disaster. That was massive cuts in the lines that had been rolled out, and they had to be kind of pushed out. We had Johannesburg Water with a major private partner, which was Suez, a big French company, pushed out after 6 years because they didn't deliver. We've got the Gauteng e-tolling with a private partner from Austria, a disaster by all accounts. So let's be very careful. When we bring in these big multinationals, whether it's McKinsey or the KPMGs, these big companies, their ethics are very weak. And I fear that the bribery and the corruption that's hardwired into many of our parastatals still may give us problems. So, for example, the biggest problem in that loss leader for Eskom would be Medupi and Kusile, which should have been about 60 billion each. They're 200 billion. There was corruption with Hitachi and Chancellor House. Hitachi paid a big fine to the United States. We haven't started prosecuting, unfortunately. Transnet, their big locomotives were with South China Rail, and the China Development Bank financed that. So I do hope that a very strong public enterprises minister, Pravin Gordhan, and a strong finance minister, Tito Mboweni, would choose to use this opportunity to say there will be a big rethink of the white elephant projects that are way over budget, chock full of corruption, clean those out, and then maybe we can look at the balance sheet and it might
But privatization and no.
That doesn't work. You're adding 30% profit margin, and plus it has to be external currency.
What do you say about that? I mean, these state-owned enterprises, at least on the face of it, are meant to play a strategic developmental purpose. That's always the argument, right? I mean, you can't leave it to to market forces and what they may choose to pursue or not choose to pursue. Some things are just strategic. The movement of freight, the supply of electricity, those kinds of things, very strategic. What do you say?
Yes, you know, food and clothing are strategic, and we allow the private sector to supply them. The fact that something is important doesn't mean the government should be doing it. On the contrary, something as important as food and clothing, thank goodness we don't have the government doing it, because that means we never have shortages of food and we're not running at losses. But let's do them one by one. And you've mentioned South African Airways. Let's just understand this, that I have a wager right now with the CEO, Mr. Jarana, in which I have a bet of 100,000 Rand, which will go to charity, that he will not be able to turn it around or make it profitable or make it viable.
You've put down a bet on it.
We have a bet, yes. We have a running wager, he and I, 100,000 Rand, and we have to pay it out of our own pockets, and it goes to charity, whoever the loser is. And so far it looks as if he's losing. So unless he can pull a miracle out of the hat, it looks like I'm going to win this bet. But let's understand, South African Airways serves no developmental, no strategic function at all. Everywhere that it flies, which is very little, its market share has tumbled. It has in fact been privatized. It's been privatized by simply losing market share. Private companies have taken over well over half of all its routes, and it is now just a small little shell of its former self. It serves no useful purpose at all to anyone other than the people who collect bribes off it. So what you can do is you can say that we can maybe invite Emirates or British Airways or somebody to take over the brand so we can keep flying the flag, so-called. You know, if you want to fly the flag, for heaven's sake, put up a flagpole. You don't paint it on the back of a plane. But nonetheless, so if someone wants South African Airways, any number of other airlines in the world will happily fly it for us. We don't need the government involved.
Iraj, what would you do? I mean, if you were in the shoes of the Finance Minister Tito Mboweni and all the policymakers in government and the ANC faced with this question, these SOEs are, you know, making losses, many of them. I mean, Eskom is said to be the biggest threat to our economy, including by the ratings agencies. What do you do?
I think it is the biggest threat, not that it's alleged. Eskom has cost us hundreds of thousands of jobs in our manufacturing, in our mining, in our construction, in every sector of the economy. So let's be absolutely clear. What we do is I think we're confusing here ownership as a private public with operations. Operations is governed by policy. We have very successful, nationally owned, but commercially operated businesses that are competing in the airline business, on the African continent, Ethiopian Airline, and many other airlines. So let's not this is an ideological debate which belongs 100 years ago. 21st century requires appropriate policies within which firms, SOEs, and private businesses operate. Even if you get private sector in unregulated environment, what will you get? You'll get a KPMG, you'll get a Trillion, you'll get capture of order of magnitude very different. You'll get cell phone companies, as we speak. They are privately owned. But because the regulation is not right, they are fleecing the customers, they are causing job losses in the economy. So let's just be absolutely clear that this.
I think that's the fear of people like Patrick Bond, right? Not to speak for you. That's your fear, that left alone to their own devices, once privately owned, these formerly state-owned enterprises would become more like the companies and entities that Iraj just mentioned.
Yes, therefore we must get the policy right first. Then ownership becomes secondary. And then those who cannot live by the policy, they must fall apart.
Yeah, policy is one thing. The most critical thing is a class analysis, an agenda and a race, an environmental analysis, who's winning and losing. I certainly don't trust the private sector here. I'm not alone. PwC, PricewaterhouseCoopers, does a poll every 2 years, and they find that of all the countries in the world, The South African corporates are the most corrupt. They look at money laundering, bribery, they look at fraud, cybercrime, a variety of topics. And again, our Santon guys, they're mostly white, come in first in the world for corruption. By the way, our civil service, our politicians only come in the Transparency International survey of corruption 71st. So maybe the assumption we're already making that the state is inherently corrupt, incompetent, isn't actually.
Just a final word to you then, Leon Lowe. Do you foresee us having this debate ongoing and never really getting to any kind of resolution that would be to your satisfaction?
I just want to say I agree with Iraj. It's about the rules. In other words, I don't think it really matters whether you make them private or not. What you must have is a level playing field.
Sure.
Have them compete completely freely in an open market, and we saw when South African Express stopped running, the next day all the passengers were picked up. So what we need is, the privatization debate's not the issue. The competition debate is, are these enterprises efficient and competitive? And I agree with Iraj, that's determined by the rules of the game. So get the rules of the game right.
Enforcing also those competition rules.
Yes, and Mr. Mboweni tells South African Airways, no more subsidies.
All right.
It is now operating and it must now compete with everyone else.
Leon Lowe, I have to stop you there. Thank you very much, Leon Lowe and Patrick Bond, as well as Iraj Abedian. Thank you so much for taking part in this discussion. Still to come, entrepreneurs don't tread the same old paths. They prefer to blaze new trails. And there's no group of people that know this better than our panel tonight. Coming up next.